we're gonna do, chapter 28 today. And, Isaiah gives Israel their last warning before the Assyrians show up, drag them off into exile for 70 years. Somebody read 1 through 4.
Woe to the majestic crown of Ephraim's drunkards, and to the fading flower of its beautiful splendor, which is on the summit above the rich valley. Woe to those who overcome with wine. Look, the Lord has a strong and mighty one, like a devastating hailstorm, like a storm with strong flooding waters. He will bring it across the land with his hand. The majestic crown of Ephraim's drunkards will be trampled underfoot. The fading flower of his beautiful splendor, which is on the summit of the rich valley, will be like a ripe fig before the summer harvest. Whoever sees it will swallow it while it is still in his hand.
Okay. What's with this wreath or this crown of pride? You know what's going on with that? Want me to take it?
Yes.
Jerusalem had a wall, and it was a square wall with 4 sides and 3 gates on each wall. A major gate and 2 gates on either side that were lesser gates. The smaller gates would be open at night to let travelers in after they had to go through an identification process. The bigger gates were closed up so that the enemy couldn't attack and then destroy them and get access to the city. Samaria, however, had a round gate, had a round wall at the top of their mountain. There was this big mountain, and if you looked up at Samaria, they had this wall all the way around it, and it was ramped. And that was the last line of defense, and that's where they went if they were attacked. They couldn't hold them from coming up the mountain. And it says that they planted trees around the bottom of it, and from a distance, it looked like a wreath or a crown that a runner might wear after he won a race, a laurel wreath or something. So it was green and it looked like a wreath. And so that was their pride and joy. Where else did we run into the wall being the pride and joy?
Jericho.
Jericho. Jericho had this big wide wall, and they could race chariots on top of it 4 abreast, and it was like a highway on top of that thing. So Jericho was another example of how people put their faith in their wall and in their gate, and this was the pride of Samaria. Jason, would you get into that? So this was the pride of Samaria. They thought they couldn't be, they thought if they stayed on top of the mountain, the enemy would be vulnerable to try to work their way up the mountain. And then when they came to this round gate, or this round wall, it would stop them and they would be secure. So they put their faith in that. What should they have put their faith in?
God.
God. Should have put their faith in God. But they decided that they were like Jericho. They said, who can transverse our wall? Who's Ephraim?
Tribes.
One of the tribes. It was the 4th child of Jacob, or Israel. The 4th tribe of Israel. Okay. Ephraim, also, the question 3, what's it represent? Ephraim represents the northern kingdom. It represents Samaria. Why was Samaria the outcast of Israel? Israel? What had caused them to fall out of grace with God? When they went into exile the time before this, the southern kingdom, which is ruled by Jerusalem, those tribes resisted marrying foreign women in Babylon. Said, we're not going to do it. Samaria, on the other hand, caved in and married the people that took Gentile wives. Now, if you go back into Leviticus and Deuteronomy and all that, there was a law against doing that. And when they did that, they became displeased with God. So Samaria was, it was considered the children of that generation were considered to be half-breeds, like the Indians, the guys that took Indian brides in the Old West. Their children were called half-breeds. They adjust my hearing and get them bad. Okay, that's better. So they were God was displeased with them, and the southern kingdom treated them like they were outcasts. Ephraim and 4 other tribes had settled the northern part of Israel, and the rest of the tribes, except for 2, settled the southern part, and the 2 tribes that were left over went west of the River Jordan and settled over in the mountains. So, what was their first sin? It talks about drunkenness, but what is behind that?
Pride. Pride.
There's something else in there though, and it's kind of vague. What goes along with drunkenness? When is it prominent in a society?
Rich. Wealth. Wealth. Guess not.
Wealth?
Wealth.
Yeah, when they become prosperous, when a society first starts out, and every society, if you've ever studied the history of empires, whenever an empire begins to take form, it's usually just a bunch of little villages and a bunch of tribes living close to one another, and then they begin to combine, and then they begin to manipulate the economy of the area. Prior to that happening, people just pretty much spend their whole entire day trying to figure out how they're going to give their kids a decent meal at the end of the day. They go out and they hunt something, or they go out and they dig something, or they plant crops, and they do it basically for themselves and their own families. Okay. Then it becomes more prosperous, and as they become more prosperous, they can farm more land, and they can farm it better, and they begin to have an excess of crops, an excess of grapes, an excess of wheat or whatever they're growing, and they begin to sell it, and they become richer, they become richer. Well, then what generally happens, they can afford to buy slaves and do nothing. And what's the old saying?
Idle hands.
Idle hands are the devil's work, or the devil's tools. What is it? Idle hands are the devil's workshop. Idle hands are the devil's tools. They're his workshop. You know, the Bible says 6 days shall you work, 1 shall you rest. And then in society, they work pretty much the whole day, 6 days a week. And then we begin to prosper, and it's 40-hour weeks and 2 days off. And then it's 40-hour weeks and 10-hour days and 3 days off. Now, I'm not knocking any of that, if you can handle it. But what usually happens, well, we have a lot of idle time on our hands. Now, we could be productive with that and spend it with the kids or whatever, but if you go back and you look at history, usually it's a negative thing as it impacts the society. And I don't see it in this room, but we were at the post office one day and the checks came in, the disability checks. They came in on the 3rd of the month. And this guy walks up and he said, "I need my disability check." And I was standing there looking up something for a policeman in town. He didn't know where somebody had moved. So he walks up to Dave and he says, "I need my check, I gotta get to work." And Dave said, "You don't work anywhere." I said, "Yeah, I do." "Where do you work?" He said, "At the bar." I said, "You got a job at the bar?" He said, "No." He said, I'm disabled because I'm an alcoholic and I gotta get my check and get down to the bar and get to work." I heard that conversation with my own ears. His job was drinking and he was getting paid for it. When society gets to that point, there's some problems. There's some problems. Well, these guys have got to that point. Their drunkenness, their idle time, their prosperity had given them a lot of time to do nothing, and it's an old story, and it's a symptom of a failing society in every single case that you study. Doesn't matter if it's Babylonians, Assyrians, Greeks, Romans, Russia, it doesn't matter who they are. As they become more and more prosperous and have less and need to work less and less, the society begins to fall apart. The work ethic is gone. You guys that are still out working, would you rather work with a 40-year-old guy, or would you rather work with a new 18-year-old?
Depends. Depends.
I know it depends, but, by and large, when I was trying to hire somebody, I pray for a 40-year-old. Because the first question out of the 18-year-old's mouth is, what?
When's
When
break?
am I off?
When's break?
When am I off? Do I have to work weekends? And, time after time I'd say, yes, you're a sub, you're going to be the lowest seniority, you're going to have to work every weekend for the next 3 or 4 years. And he'd just walk out the door like, well, I don't want this job. He'd leave. $16 an hour in French Lick, Indiana, E1A part of it. Happened to me a half a dozen times. 40-year-old guy comes in, he says, wow, $16 an hour, I'll do anything you want. 18-year-old guy, he said, I have dates on the weekend, I can't do that.
Can't afford a date if you don't do it.
Okay, so their first sin was prosperity and the way that they handled it. They let their prosperity bring them down. Second sin, if you look down in there, was they ridiculed Isaiah. They ridiculed the prophets. They scorned him. And a lot of prophets got stoned to death. And that was their second sin. Verse 14 through 22, who was Judah? He was Jacob's fourth son. And he represents Jerusalem. What was their first, let's read it. 14 through 22.
Therefore, listen to this message from the Lord, you scoffing rulers in Jerusalem. You boast, we have struck a bargain to cheat death and have made a deal to dodge the grave. The coming destruction can never touch us, for we have built a strong refuge made of lies and deception. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I am placing a foundation stone in Jerusalem, a firm and tested stone. It is a precious cornerstone that is safe to build on. Whoever believes need never be shaken. I will test you with the measuring line of justice and the plumb line of righteousness. Since your refuge is made of lies, a hailstorm will knock it down. Since it is made of deception, a flood will sweep it away. I will cancel the bargain you made to cheat death, and I will overturn your deal to dodge the grave. When the terrible enemy sweeps through, he will be trampled into the ground. Again and again, that flood will come morning after morning, day and night until you are carried away. This message will bring terror to your people. The bed you have made is too short to lie on. The blankets are too narrow to cover you. The Lord will come as he did against the Philistines at Mount Perazim and against the Amorites at Gibeon. He will come to do a strange thing. He will come to do an unusual deed. For the Lord of heaven's armies, has plainly said that he is determined to crush the whole land. So scoff no more, or your punishment will be even greater.
Okay, what was her first sin? Verse 14 and verse 22. This begins and ends with what? See him word.
Mocking.
Mocking. Who are they mocking? God. They were doing it by way of Isaiah. They were mocking Isaiah and making fun of him, but his message was from God, so you're right. They were mocking God. Remember when Saul was chasing David, and David gave a command to his army, and he told that army, and he told his soldiers, he gave them a command concerning Saul. Remember what that was?
Not to harm him. Not to harm him.
Yes, that's exactly right. Specifically, he said, do not touch God's anointed. Not only not harm him, don't touch him. He belongs to God. God put him in that position. It is not for us to judge him. Do not mock God's anointed. And I didn't know that for several years. And there was a situation where I was carrying mail. And I was walking 11 miles a day. And I had really bad ingrown toenails. So I'd gone to a doctor and he said, we're going to have to take those toenails out. Have you ever lost a nail and touched that area underneath your finger, underneath your toe? That is the most sensitive place on your body. I mean, I was going to have to wear some kind of protection over both my big toes and walk 11 miles a day. And they were going to take the roots and everything out, and the toenail was not coming back. I was sitting at home on my day off. I think my day off was Thursday. I was sitting at home. When I'd get home from work, I wore the white socks. When I get home from work, the end of my socks would be red with blood. The toenails would bleed all day long. And it was horrible. Terrible. Well, I was sitting there, and I didn't feel like doing much because it was my day off, and my toes were really sore. And I think I was making a rod, a spinning rod, to go fishing. I made my own rods, and it was something you could do. You could sit down and do it, and not have to be on your feet, and it would give my toes a rest on my day off. Well, there was something on TV that I was watching. Channel 40 used to be the Christian nation up north of Indianapolis. It came out of Noblesville. And so I would watch that a lot. Well, there was one guy on it that I thought was a real disgrace to Christianity. I thought he was, I thought he was a charlatan. He was a faith healer kind of guy, and I thought, this guy's a joke. And it turns out I was right. He was out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it turns out he was right. They found out that he had put an electrical wire in a chair where he had sick people sit, and he put his hand on it, and they had a button in the back, and he could start to pray for him and push the button, and a little shock would go through him, and the guy would think it was the Holy Spirit, and he did it so it would booster his faith. Well, I didn't know any of that, but just listening to him and watching him, I thought he was a real jerk. I thought he was a joke. And it turns out he was. But on that particular day, he's praying for people and he's going through this, and I'm in the middle of wrapping this rod. And he said, and there's one person out there who is going to have surgical on his feet, and the Lord is healing you right now. And I looked up and I remember thinking, oh yeah, right, this is going to work. And I kept on working on the rod, and the day went out and I got to feeling better, and I got up and I went outside and I worked in the garden a little bit. Went to work the next day and I carried my route, and I didn't think about it very much. But when I got home that night, there was no redness, there was no blood on my socks. I took my socks off and I looked at my feet, and both of my toes, big toes, were normally bright red. They were inflamed most of the time. They were pink. And I've never had an ingrown toenail from that day. Now the Lord was using the guy. And I used to scoff at him. I used to mock him. I used to tell everybody he was a joke. And I got convicted about that. And sometime after that, I read what David had done to Saul. He said, don't touch him. God's anointed him. God's using him for whatever. You do not touch God's anointed. And if you do, there's going to be consequences. And David wouldn't allow his soldiers to touch God's anointed. I learned that same lesson that day with my toenails. It wasn't for me to judge that man. God didn't put him in that position. He turned out to be had a problem with prostitutes, and he had done the chair thing with the button and all that. And he ended up in jail. So I was right, and probably wouldn't have wanted to have sat under his ministry. But it wasn't my place to judge him, and it wasn't my place to evaluate his ministry in any way, because my toes were healed, and I gotta wonder how many other people were healed because he was up there. They had stories afterward, after he went to jail, people were talking about he would walk off stage and he would be so drunk that he'd almost collapse, and people had to catch him and take him to his dressing room. So all kinds of things came out after that. But when he was on that stage preaching and doing whatever he did, he was God's, and it wasn't for me or anybody else to judge the man. It wasn't for them to mock Isaiah, because when they mocked Isaiah, they mocked God. And what was their second sin? Politics. They made alliances with heathen nations all around them to be safe from the Assyrians. What did Isaiah say? He said, if you trust in God, God will protect you. Pretty simple, right? I mean, how much easier could it be? If you trust in God, God will protect you. And they went running after these other nations, and they made alliances and treaties. Said, when the Assyrians come, we'll band together and we will have victory over them. I, me, my, we. God had said, you trust in me, you let me have control, and I will protect you. You will flourish. The enemies will not come in. The insects will not come in. Your crops will burst into harvest. You will have a great life. They decided to go with politics. How does that usually work out?
Usually not too good.
Or the IRS.
Yeah. That's not good. You know, the bottom line is, we can either trust in God or we can trust in Social Security. We can trust in God or we can trust in the government to take care of us. My grandpa had 6 kids, put 4 of them through college. And he was a carpenter and had an 80 acre farm. He was back before Social Security, and when he died at 96, he left every one of his children major inheritances. He did it by saving his money. He did it by everything on the farm had to produce. When they lived down in Georgia, they didn't have a lawn. Grandma would go out and sweep the red clay. He'd go out and sweep the yard, sweep up the leaves. And we were down there one time in the summer, and I was building steps down to the spring for her, so she could get down to the spring. It was kind of steep, so I dug in and I laid flat rocks so that she could have kind of steps to get down to the spring. I worked like 3 or 4 days on that. Well, I came back up and they were having a conversation, and my grandma looked at him and he said, "Jake, you know, everybody on this road has got grass in front of their house." He said, "Can't we have a lawn?" And Grandpa looked at her and said, "Well, Maude, there's no reason for us to have a lawn. We don't have a goat."
You'd have to mow it. You'd have to mow it. That'd be more expensive. Then you'd have to buy a mower, and then you'd have to buy gas.
You'd have to
and
buy a
everything else.
lawnmower, so you'd have to mow it. How productive is that? Okay, then you got to put gas in the lawnmower. Then you got to change the spark plug in the lawnmower. You got to change the oil in the lawnmower. And the grass is not going to feed us or anything else. We don't need a lawn because we don't have a goat. Well, that was the way Grandpa thought about it. But in the end, he ended up richer than a whole bunch of younger people who worked their whole entire life and ended up having to depend on Social Security for their existence the last 15, 20 years of their life. And basically, most of them had to work during that time too, because when they stopped getting that paycheck from the factory, the Social Security was less than half of that, and then they had to add something to it. We just, well, let's not get into that any deeper. But the bottom line is, we can either trust God to take care of us. Now, that doesn't mean we get to sit around and do nothing. But it does mean that if we will do our part, God will make sure that we get taken care of. He will make sure that we are blessed, that we are prosperous. If we will be generous to people who are in need more than we are, and if we will support the church, God will take care of his children. Now, the Bible also says, be good stewards of what you have. We can't waste our paycheck, and we can't waste what we have. But the bottom line is, what is the best plan for salvation? God and his blessing, and following his lead, or trusting the government?
Is that a trick question?
What?
Is that a trick question? I think there's only one answer on that one.
Well, it's a question all of us have to ask. I don't want to get into it any deeper, but bottom line is, what I have done with my investment provides more for me and my wife and my grandkids than what the government sends me at the first of every month. And when it was, now, I don't live in a fancy house, and those that you have seen it probably think it's ugly. But my kids didn't have to pay that one dime of student loans. We decided in the beginning that that house isn't fancy, but it's warm and it's dry, and we paid cash for it, hands down. And then we saved our money and put both of our kids through some pretty expensive colleges. And the bottom line is they didn't have to pay one dime back to student loans. You gotta decide what your priorities are, and you gotta decide from where your help comes from and where you're gonna put your trust. Well, the Southern Kingdom decided they were gonna put their trust in the allies with a bunch of Gentiles. And how did that work out? 70 years in exile. The last part of it, and it's pretty quick, 23 to 29.
Give ear and hear my voice, listen and hear my speech. Does the plowman keep plowing all day to sow? Does he keep turning his soil and breaking the clods? When he has leveled its surface, does he not sow the black cumin and scatter the cumin, plant the wheat in rows, the barley in the appointed place, and the spelt in its place? For he instructs him in right judgment, his God teaches him. For the black cumin is not threshed with the threshing sledge, nor a cartwheel rolled over the cumin. The black cumin is beaten out with a stick, the cumin with a rod. The bread flour must be ground, therefore he does not thresh it forever, break it with his cartwheel, or crush it with his horsemen. This also comes from the Lord of hosts, who is wonderful in counsel and excellent in guidance.
Okay, this is a parable. This is a prophecy in parable form. So you gotta know what each element represents. Who's the farmer? We are. And
God. God? Jesus, he farms.
Jesus.
Jesus.
This is Jesus. Hang on to that answer, Jason. You'll need it in a minute. Okay? All right. It says in there, his God. Who's that referring to? If the farmer's Jesus, who's his God referring to? The Father. Referring to the Father. Okay. And Jason, well, who is the harvest?
I guess we are.
We are. You're exactly right. You got that one. Okay, we're the harvest. And it's talking about the age of salvation. It's talking about when the age of grace will come and the church will be established and there will be salvation for all the people on earth who are willing to accept it. It's opening the door to Isaiah's several chapters on who exactly Jesus is. Okay? And we're going to see this over and over again in the next few chapters. So we'll get into that.